Very good. Welcome. Appreciate you being here tonight. You will notice right off the bat that my study partner and traveling companion, Jeff Pierpont, is not with us. Jeff had surgery today at Northeastern Vermont. He's got a bum foot, and had to have a little surgery to get that cleaned up, and hopefully he will be out of the hospital sometime Sunday afternoon. So I'm going to have to do this a little differently than we had planned, because I certainly planned to do it with Jeff in tandem, and we'll miss having him here tonight, but we'll remember him in our thoughts and our prayers, and others among our community who are not well and who are grieving. We're mindful of all those this evening. But without further ado, let me say what brings us together tonight. In June, I was a part of a Holocaust study trip that was sponsored by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, by the Johannesburg Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and by the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. How many of you know where the New Brunswick Theological Seminary is? Let's narrow it down a little bit. Is it in the United States or is it in Canada? Canada? How many say Canada? How many say United States? Okay. How many say New Jersey? Okay. New Jersey. New Brunswick Theological Seminary is in New Jersey. So one of the oldest seminaries in America, if not, not the oldest. Thanks, Joe. But it's old because it was started by the Dutch Reformed Church. Dutch Reformed, because New York was New Amsterdam before it was New York. The Dutch have been here a long time, and so New Brunswick is connected to the Dutch Reformed Church. Where else did the Dutch do some colonizing? In or around a place called South Africa. So the New Brunswick Theological Seminary has a vested interest in being accountable for the theologizing they did that enabled apartheid. It's a group of Christians taking responsibility for bad theology. And it's a pretty explicit acknowledgement that bad theology is deadly. We know that, right? So that's part of what brought us together. On paper, those might look like, what do these three things have in common? How are they alike? What matters to them? Humanity matters. Humanity matters. And so we gathered as a group, as many as 25 in our study group from 9 countries. Mozambique, Nepal, South Africa, Germany, the United States, and some other countries that I can't remember. But there were 9 of them. I remember hearing that frequently. There were 9 different countries were represented in our group. And we started the day with a man named Konstanty Gaber. He's a Polish journalist, among other things, and Polish journalist does not sum up at all or come close to getting at the stuff that's inside of this guy's head. I think he was born around 1950 in Poland, educated in Poland. What's happening in Poland in 1950? It's only 5 years after the war, but it's 5 years into discovering what it means to be a Soviet bloc country, okay? And so, let me just say, Konstanty has seen a lot of stuff, a whole lot of stuff, and very, very wise man. And so we start, also, he's just going to be a guest lecturer for about the first hour of our study together on day 1. The academic that's going to be with us every step of the way is her name is Tally. And she is the founder of the Johannesburg Center for Genocide and Holocaust Studies. And she's going to accompany us every step of the way. But Constantine gets us started. And what he does in an hour is he gives us a history of Poland, a history of Jews in Poland, a history of Warsaw, a history of, and so there are just these layers and layers and layers and layers of history. And I mean, you could, if you're that sort of person, you know, who kind of geeks out over history, and you had enough coffee or whatever your beverage of choice was, you could have sat and listened to him talk forever. But a couple of things that he points out. You know, and I think the previous slide just said that, you know, for a long time, for like 400 years before World War II, there have been Jewish people in Poland, Jewish people in all stratas of Polish life, from farmers to technicians to educators, poets, writers, commerce, everything. There were integral part. There were 3 million Jews, over 3 million Jews in 1938 living in Poland. Over 3 million Jews. Today, there are barely 5,000 Jews living in Poland. 3 million, big number, right? 5,000, not a big number, not a big number. But prior to 1938, 400 years back from that, there is a history. It's almost my impression, you know, and, you know, for whatever, you know, you can dig into the history of a place and a people for, you know, 7, 8, 9 days. But my impression was almost like the Jews living inside of Poland were kind of, it was kind of like Israel before there was an Israel. It was, if the Jews had a state before 1940, it was inside of Poland. They flourished there. That's not to say that there wasn't discrimination, there was, but they flourished there in a way that they might not have, would not have in maybe any other country in Europe. But a lot of folks did well there, and life was good there. Before the war, over 3 million. Today, 5,000. Constantine is talking to us about post-war Poland and the attitude as they start to just leave Warsaw the way it is, because after, you know, there's an uprising in the ghetto. The Jews in the ghetto have their uprising, but then there's a Warsaw uprising. That the Poles in Greater Warsaw, they have an uprising as well. And after that, the Germans turn 95% of Warsaw to rubble. There's nothing left there. And so there is one thought after the war that we just leave the rubble there. That will be the memorial to what's happened here. This rubble will mark from now on those who died here. That'll be the way we remember them. But they decided not to do that. They decided to rebuild. And so Warsaw is this ancient city that's only 80 years old, which is kind of strange in a surreal Disney World kind of way, if you'll give me that latitude. That, you know, I didn't know what else to compare it to, because there is an old city in Warsaw. You know, every European city of any, you know, stature has an old city. And you go into the old city and the architecture is different. You look at it, you know, oh, these buildings are really old buildings. And they're not. They're 80 years old. They were built to look really old. They rebuilt the old city and tried to replicate what it looked like before the bombing. There's one church in the old city. I think I posted a picture of this on Facebook, but the Germans had driven some kind of remote control little mini tank into the sanctuary full of explosives and detonated it to destroy the church. And when the Poles were rebuilding it, they took a piece of that little mini tank track and they stuck it into the side of the wall at the foundation of the new church, which I read whatever you want to into that, but I kind of took it as, you can blow our church up if you want to, and we will use your weapons of war to, reconstruct it. Demonstrated some pretty amazing resolve, I thought. But Constantine is talking about the tension in post-Poland, post-war Poland, because the Poles have lost a ton of people too. A lot of Polish people died in the war. Maybe 10% of the Polish population. I think there were about, roughly speaking, don't hold me to these numbers, but roughly 30 million Poles before the war, and probably 10% of them are dead. 3 million Jews before the war, 90% of them are dead. Big difference percentage-wise there. So there's this, this victimhood is pushing up against, the narrative there. Who suffered the most? For whom was it worst? And then constantly, he's just talking along and he's not trying to be snarky or anything. He says, it's like one day you live in Nagasaki and you think, oh my God, this is the worst thing that could ever happen. Except then you hear about what happened in Hiroshima. And is that worse? And I'm sitting there thinking, did that guy just use a military action carried out by my country to make a Holocaust comparison? And he did, and he didn't even blink an eye, and nobody really, got offended by it because we were a group from 9 other countries, and I think only 4 of us were from the United States. So we just said, okay, all right. But that stuck with me, that you're trying to find a way to express something about the Holocaust, and you look to America for your point of comparison. What else did Constantine tell us? Just a city rebuilt on rubble, literally. That's not a metaphor, that's not a figurative, literally. There are blocks, there are buildings that look like, that there's been a huge mound of earth put underneath them and then a foundation built on top of it. There's rubble under there. And some of it is brick, and some of it is mortar, and some of it is stone, and some of it is wood, and some of it is human beings. Not unusual in a new construction site in Warsaw, to have to stop and say, who is this? Who was this? Where does this person need to be buried? So we appreciated our time with Constantine. Wish it had been more. This is why I wanted you to be closer to the screen, but this is the memorial built early, memorial to the Jews who rose up in the ghetto. And we're talking the whole week about layers and layers of memory. When did the monument get put up, and who put it up will tell you, a lot about what they remember or who they're remembering. This is a Jewish monument, and it's put up in a section of the ghetto, or where the ghetto was, and that is important. The placement of it and who places it is important. And it's not long after the war relatively speaking, that monument is placed there. And then some of you may remember this. Next slide. That man kneeling there is Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt is the Chancellor of West Germany. East Germany? Oh, West Germany. I knew somebody would set me straight on that. West Germany. And he's kneeling there. And so that memorial that already had memory laid on top of it becomes a place where another memory is made for the Chancellor of Germany to be kneeling and remembering, essentially saying, yeah, we're sorry, we did that. That happened. Another way to remember, you're going to rebuild most of the city, but not going to replace the floor. In the building that was located adjacent to the Great Synagogue in Warsaw, the Mackey Synagogue, or the synagogue on Mackey Street, or that building is right next to it. It was the yeshiva, the school, and it was bombed, it was damaged, but it was not destroyed completely. And today it houses the Jewish Historical Institute, and it's a nice building, modern and everything, but the floor is still marked by the bombing and the fire from when the Germans destroyed the city after the uprising. Another way to remember. That is a milk can. We know what those are, right? We're in Vermont. 2 other milk cans, and maybe another one, maybe more than one other one, still buried in Warsaw, were the receptacles for the written material, the archival material created by a project within the ghetto called Og Shabbat. It was a group that met on the Sabbath to write down everything that they could think of to write down. The person who started it and pulled together the members of this archival team had seen the Germans with cameras, with motion picture cameras, and it occurred to him that, they're going to tell the story. And he had the wherewithal to realize that there needed to be a counter narrative because he did not want it, Nazi washed or whitewashed, or he didn't want to turn it into a propaganda piece. He wanted somebody to tell the truth about what life was like in the Warsaw Ghetto, and so they. I thought that was a microphone. Oh, just a motorcycle. So they started writing every Sabbath, and an amazing amount of material that they put into those milk cans, and they are, what became, the story of what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay, this is the synagogue at. Give me a second. Tikochin. One thing that did not improve on this trip for me at all, not that I had really any capacity before I left on this trip, but my pronunciation of Polish words is about as bad as it was before I went. But this is a small town, maybe 4,000 people at the time of the war in 1938. But it's an old town. That synagogue that you're looking at was built in the 1600s. It's been there a while. The Jews have a history in Poland. In 1840, in this town, they're going to start a school, or they're going to make their public school, the place where their kids go to school, it's going to be a Christian Jewish school. These people living together in this village, know each other well enough, trust each other enough, they're going to educate their children together in 1840. It's about 20 years before we start shooting each other. They're sitting down to educate their children together. You can see this building is, you're in a small town. It's not a big town at all. But this is a building, it's a substantial building architecturally. I mean, you see it, and it dominates the square. It took some resources to put together. If you've ever been a part of a public building project, either for a church or a clubhouse or a fire hall, everybody has to chip in, and somebody has to bring, some resources to get that done. There were enough resources in that town to build a building like that. And this is the inside of it. It's a very worshipful space. I don't know if you can see in this picture, but those are the Hebrew scripture and Psalms written on the wall all the way around. There were no hymn books. You just had to look at the wall, and there you were, worshiping away. And here's our group in front of one of the walls. It's a beautiful synagogue. And how many Jews are in that town today? 0. None. That's the impact of the Holocaust. That's the impact of the Holocaust. What happened to those Jews? Holocaust, for me, when I think about Holocaust, I think about concentration camps, I think about death camps. My tendency was just to kind of lump them all together, and that's not the way that it happened. There were early on, as Hitler came to power, concentration camps. A lot of people died in concentration camps because of inadequate food, inadequate health care, inadequate a lot of things. But they weren't designed to kill. They just weren't necessarily meant to keep people alive. Especially the camps in Germany. There were more labor camps. That's why people got put into camps, slave labor, free labor. The Holocaust starts not in camps, but with the Einsatzgruppen, the teams of squads of soldiers who would have a local farmer dig 2 or 3 pits somewhere out in the middle of a field, and the Jews in a particular town would all be rounded up and taken out to those pits and shot. And that's what we know happened to the Jews at Tikocin. They're a nearby forest, not very different than the woodlot, between the parsonage and the lake. We walked through it, and you don't know it's a graveyard. You don't know thousands of people were killed. You don't know that they're still buried just a few feet from it, except, there are these green iron fences, metal fences around the mass graves that have been identified at this location. And, what you see in this picture is the iron fence, that's the state marking the site, saying we're going to remember these people this way, we're going to identify their grave. And then if you see on top of that little fence rail, candles, and that's true. We didn't go to a single memorial anywhere that, somebody, and you'll see it in some other pictures as well, these memorials get used. People come and they remember, and they leave candles, and sometimes the plaques that are put on top of plaques are from, families who have, who know, they've done that research, they know where their relative was, and they remember. This particular plaque in this picture, I don't know if you can make out who uttered these words and put this plaque on this site, but that is a note from Pope John Paul II, Polish Pope, and another layer of memory. It's a very tense thing, and it's a very complicated thing, because we know Poland is a very Catholic country, and I've heard that all my life. I think maybe we heard it because you have a Polish Pope for much of your life, and you think he comes from a very Catholic country. Saying Poland is a very Catholic country is as understated a thing as I've ever heard in my life. It's not a very Catholic country. It is a very, very Catholic country. Even in 2024, as we move globally to a more secularized age, Poland is a very Catholic country. And every village has a church, and they are not playing. I mean, they are like, that's a church. Boom. And when you're in a city, they're not just churches. Every church looks like a cathedral. And you know two things. There were a lot of Polish people who were willing to kill Jews. There were a lot of Polish people who were willing to collaborate with the Germans to take the property of Jews, to take the lives of Jews. We also know that there were a lot of Polish people who were willing to help Jews stay alive. That was my whole question on the front end of this trip. How do ordinary people become participants in a Holocaust? Not all those people were evil. Not all those people were psychotic or demented or whatever we use to describe the people who imagined the Shoah. How do ordinary people do that? And one of the things that I learned on the trip is sometimes ordinary people did incredibly brave and heroic stuff to keep people from dying. It's complicated. It's 6,000 Catholic priests, Polish Catholic priests, will die in concentration camps. It's a complicated story. This is the memorial at Treblinka. It's a Soviet-era memorial. Any of you who've ever visited any Eastern Bloc countries and seen what Soviet memorials look like, they are very manly. There's a lot of, they take up a lot of space in the square. And what you may not be able to see is the top of that memorial. Those are faces carved in the top of it. And then, of course, it's split down the middle. Maybe that's symbolic of brokenness. And then at the bottom, you see, the wreaths and the candles and all the stuff that people doing remembrance have left there. And then this is another angle on the centerpiece of the memorial, but the memorial would not fit into one screenshot. The memorial is that centerpiece, and then it's a scattering of stones like the ones you see in the foreground here, just everywhere. And on some of them are written the names of villages that were impacted by the Holocaust, by the Germans. It's a Soviet-era memorial. They're not going to recognize individuals. They're recognizing communities. Not sure I get all the nuance there, but that's, there are no individual names on any of those stones. They're names of villages. And then until, because we have traveling in our group that day that we're at Treblinka, a woman named Wanda. And Wanda was a little girl in Warsaw as the war broke out. Her mother was a pediatrician. And her mother managed to get Wanda somewhere safe. And her mother stayed where she was to take care of her patients. And so her mother died at Treblinka. And Wanda was with us, and Wanda's son Luke was with us. And while we were there that day, Wanda and Luke placed this stone with their mother and grandmother's name, Helena Rothstein, in among that sea of stones. And I don't know that it was proper that we did it. We did not have enough Jewish people in our group to say a proper Kaddish, but we did pray in that way for her, and we remembered her in that place, and added in our own way another layer of memory. And it was interesting to watch. Luke kind of, he understood, because in essence, I mean, if you're a real stickler for the rules, that stone might fall into the category of graffiti. And some caretaker who wants to clean up the memorial because it's not a part of the memorial would come take it away. And as we were remembering his grandmother, Luke acknowledged that. I don't know how long this stone is going to stay here, but we're going to remember her in this moment. And to hear a grandson talk about a grandmother that he never met, in that way, it was just a really, really powerful thing. And that was at Treblinka. And I'm not really, I think I'm trying to go a little bit in order. I'm certainly not trying to give you pictures of every place and everything that we stopped to see or retell that, but the things that moved me, that captured me, I'm certainly trying to share. This is the Jewish cemetery at Lodz. And I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it's spelled Lodz, and it's got that little slash mark through it, and that little slash mark means it's more of a W sound than an L sound. So anyway, that's where we are. It's a newer city. It's an industrial city, a lot of manufacturing going on when the war starts. And this Jewish cemetery, the Wall of which it exists before the war starts. So there's a significant Jewish community in this city. And today, on the outside, see mounted on the wall and then lined up along the outside of the wall, those are gravestones. And they're gravestones that have been found somewhere. Because oftentimes, the Nazis would use gravestones from Jewish cemeteries to pave roads, to build walls, to construction material. And so you don't know where they came from. You don't know where the grave was. So they get returned to the cemetery and treated in a respectful way. But In a city that had a Jewish population that found it necessary to build this cemetery and put a substantial wall around it. Not an insignificant population. But today, there are not enough Jews living in the town to maintain the cemetery. It was another stark reminder of a community that once was vibrant and thriving and now is virtually non-existent. Yeah. Same town at I'm going to try to get the name of this train station correct here. Radagast, the Radagast Memorial. This is the train station that will be the departure point for Jews in Wodes to go to Chelmno. Will be the death camp where most of them will die. And it won't just be Polish Jews. There will be some Jews from other countries that will also be brought to the ghetto at Wodes and who will die there as well. This is an actual train car. If any of you have been to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., you've seen an actual train car there as well. Yeah, it just you can't go in these cars, but you can stand and look in them, and you're like, just stand there as long as it takes you to imagine the car being so full of people that there's room for not one more person to be put in that car. Now, I'm skipping Chelmno. Not sure what happened to my camera, except it was blistering hot that day, and I don't think I took very many pictures there. But I will say this: Chelmno was one of the places. It was stood up for Operation Reinhardt, and this recognizes a shift. We're moving from concentration camps where we're putting slave laborers and we're working them to death. Operation Reinhardt is, now we've decided what we're going to do. And what we're going to do is we're going to kill all the Jews that we can. And we can't just keep lining them up in pits and shooting them, because that is emotionally traumatizing for our soldiers. Yeah, they get that feedback. We can't keep making our soldiers do that, because it's psychologically it's ripping them apart. So we've got to find a more efficient way to do what we want to do. And Chelmno is one of the places where they start using gas, but not the gas they'll ultimately use, the Xylon. This will be carbon monoxide. They'll take the tube, connect the muffler, and they'll drive folks around until they die, and then they'll bury them in pits at Chelmno. That's where that train is going. It'll be different at Birkenau. There'll be 5 gas chambers there, 5 crematoria. One back up the road at Auschwitz I. That's the main entrance to Birkenau. And this is the what remains of crematoria gas chamber number 5. Because when the war is ending, and the Germans start blowing stuff up because they don't want there to be any evidence of what they've done, which, okay, yeah, you're going to be able to hide that. But I don't think that's going to work out the way you think it's going to work out. Pavel, Sawicki is the press officer at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he was our tour guide for 6 hours the day we were there. And he was amazing, just all kinds of facts. And until we got here. And there was just something that changed about him in a moment while we were standing there. And he said something like, you're learning, and you're remembering, and you're memorializing is meaningless if you're not seeing where this, and he pointed to the ruins of that crematorium, where this is happening right now. And then he went back to script and continued the tour, and he wasn't, he was amazing in his knowledge and the way he was willing to share it with us. And don't ever go hiking with him. He will walk the soles off your feet. That's in Birkenau. Back up the road in Auschwitz, and I didn't take this picture. I stole it from Wikipedia. Maximilian Kolbe was a prisoner at Auschwitz, and the Nazis were getting ready to punish somebody somebody was getting ready to die. 10 of them, I think. And Maximilian, who was a Franciscan priest, said, I'll take his place. And, anyway, the way it worked out, his German guards allowed him to swap places with the guy who was going to be killed, or one of the guys who was going to be killed that day. And, so that happened there. And so now, not far from Auschwitz, and you may remember when this story was a thing, but Maximilian's a saint now in the Catholic Church because, he was martyred for the faith in that place. And, Catholics like to be, there's a proximity element to, their understanding of saints. And if you can go walk where the saint lived, if you can go be where the saint did saintly stuff, you want to be there. And so I don't know if it's still active or not, but there was for a time a convent or a monastery dedicated to Maximilian, just right there next to that. You've got a cell block in Auschwitz, and maybe 50 yards over that way, you've got a convent of a religious order. Was housed, or may still be housed. I don't know if it's active there, but Maximilian was one of the ordinary people who did what he could with what he had in the moment to push back and resist. There are layers and layers of history, and just happened to be walking by this wall, which does not have anything to do with the Holocaust at all. But this wall is in the city of Krakow, but it originated in the Polish city of Gdansk. And it's part of the wall that Lech Walesa scaled in 1980 when the Solidarity movement was being born. And so now, to remember that, evidently the city of Gdansk is sending pieces of it all around the country. and layers and layers of memory, just surrounded by memory. It's a plaque on the wall of a building that housed a pharmacy in Krakow, and that man's name, Tad Pankiewicz, was the pharmacist there, and is recognized today by Yad Vashem as righteous among the Gentiles, as someone who worked tirelessly, courageously to save Jewish lives during those days. I don't know, you think of pharmacists as being sort of reserved, kind of studious sort of people, but there he was, saving people's lives, putting his own life at risk, because, you're not long into the war where, it's not just a matter of doing harm and stealing and dehumanizing Jewish folks until it becomes a crime for non-Jewish folks to do anything to help or to protect or defend. So if it's not just you putting yourself at risk if you intervene on behalf of your Jewish neighbor, you're putting your whole household, your whole family at risk if you intervene and help. So that's no small thing. That's in the ghetto. That pharmacy was in the ghetto in Krakow, which was not bombed during the war, and it really is an amazing city, and as old as it looks in places, because it was not bombed. And that gate, anybody recognize that gate? Where have you seen that gate before? How many of you have seen Schindler's List? That's it. That's the gate to Schindler's factory. Tally, our academic, founder of the Johannesburg Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, this is where the tour becomes real for her, because her father and her uncle were two of the men who were on Schindler's List. She's not with us this whole time except for Schindler's List. And so, walking with her through this space, this Schindler's factory today is a museum, not dedicated solely to the Holocaust, but to the history of Krakow. But every museum in Poland just about has some component to it that remembers the war and remembers the tragedy of it. Again, scenes from Schindler's List, the stone house, the commandant's house in Schindler's List, the upper floor from which he would wake up, eat breakfast, grab his gun, and shoot down into the camp if folks weren't moving fast enough. That house still stands right there. And then here is the memorial at the camp just right outside of Krakow, Plaszow, I think. And this is the first monument after the war built there. And again, it's a very, to me, I don't know, I find it very moving, just the way it depicts people grieving and, right across the chest, just brokenhearted. And this will give you some sense of the size of it. Here's a picture of our group in front of it. Yeah, I mean, it was a massive monument. What I didn't take a picture of is, behind it on pathways around, since then, there's a new layer of monuments because, when the Berlin Wall falls down, a whole new set of people get to come into the space and have their memories that they weren't able to have before the wall came down. which, is a part of, yeah. And then the remembering becomes a part of the story. And it all kind of gets layered on top of each other again. In an interesting way. I don't know. Now, that's a report from my trip. Now I'm gonna venture out and see if this applies, and maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But memorials. We have a few memorials in our country too, And really, they have been much in the news in the last decade or so in some urban areas. Somebody's car is being stolen. Anyway, General Lee's monument in Richmond, it's a huge monument. Or it was a huge monument. It's not there anymore. You guys probably don't know this, do you? Which way was that monument facing? General Lee on his horse? How many of you know the monument I'm talking about? Robert E. Lee, on Traveler, on a horse. The horse was facing south. You know why the horse was facing south? The horse's rear end would be facing north. I don't. It's just the way I always heard it explained. But remembering and how we remember becomes a part of the story. That monument was not on Monument Avenue in Richmond, but Monument Avenue, Stonewall Jackson, I think Jefferson Davis had a monument on Monument Avenue in Richmond, and a couple of other Confederate generals had monuments on Monument Avenue. Those monuments were put there because they could be put there. And they were put there, not just to tell what happened, but to tell who was in charge of telling the story and who controlled the narrative now. And, they did something. Basically, they honored and esteemed people who were traitors to our country. That's what they did. But they also tried to maintain a value system and a lifestyle that they wanted to perpetuate. And monuments were no small part of that. And now they're gone. And that is another telling and another layer of the story. So, enough about far-off monuments, because we have monuments in Greensboro too. And in 1941, this monument was put up to Constance Bliss and Moses Sleeper. And down at the bottom it says, lest we forget, that they were murdered. This memorial was erected, lest we forget. And so now, just below that monument, someone has installed a new monument. It tells another layer of the story, another layer of memory. I don't know if anybody would have thought to put anything like that up in 1941. And how we which one of those stories is true? Well, both those stories are true. What we choose to remember, that's what we have to be accountable for. Okay, so enough of me talking. Any questions? Shelley.
No question. I often used Schindler's List as a classroom tool for discussion and understanding. And I'm watching your photos, and I just don't get how we can do this to another human being without recognizing humanity. I just don't get it. It is so It's overwhelming. So, no question, just how? How to do this?
It doesn't start with gas chambers. It doesn't start with crematoria. It starts with making somebody less than human. And that's happening in a million different ways, 24/7 in our current. Yeah.
It happens on our border. It's happened in Ukraine. It's happening. It's real. It's like I just don't get it.
It's happening. It's happening to women of all colors and economic classes. Do you have a hand up?
I wonder how your view changed. You said you really kind of started out trying to ask, how can people do this to one another? Did you gain any insight that answered that question for you?
Say the question again.
When you said the question was, how can people do this to one another? And then you had this experience. Did you have any more clarity to answer that question when you came back?
No, not as far as answering the how, but there's this one slide that I thought I put in there, but evidently I didn't. And it's a very simple quote from a Holocaust survivor, Levi Primo Levi, an Italian chemist who survived the Holocaust. And he said, it did happen. We know it happened. Therefore, it can happen again. But yeah, the how of it, you just get a group of people. I mean, it feels like we're on the edge of it in so many ways, in so many places. Just a word from the right person, and yeah, there could be a whole lot of people dead before morning. Yeah, Ken?
Get anything into how did the churches influence the Holocaust? How were they involved?
How did the churches influence the Holocaust? About 2/3 of them bought the T-shirt and said, "We're all in." In 1933, a movement emerged called the Confessing Church, and they signed what's called the Barmen Declaration, and it's 1933, so it's well ahead of a lot of stuff. But they were saying then that Nazism is not Christianity, and the Christianity that we practice is very different than what somehow the Nazis and Hitler found a way to become enmeshed with the state church in Germany, and I think actually had a hand in appointing the bishop of the 60% of Christians in Germany who were a part of the church that was okay or went along with Nazism. But the Barmen Declaration was what came out of the Confessing Church. That would have been Niemöller, that would have been Bonhoeffer, those are the names that we recognize from there. They weren't the only ones in that. Niemöller will survive, Bonhoeffer will be hung. But it's interesting. I have a quote here from Karl Barth, who was not a German. He was from Switzerland. If I can find it. He said this in 1914. So a whole world war earlier. Simply out of the question that God helps the Germans or the French or the English or the Americans. God does not even help us Swiss. God helps justice and love. God helps the kingdom of heaven, and that exists across all national boundaries. Foolish mixing of patriotism, war enthusiasm, and Christian faith could one day lead to the bitterest disappointment. And it did. And it did. Again, because he said that in 1914, so bitter disappointment in World War I, another bitter disappointment in World War II, and we're drinking that same poison, in public water fountains all over our country as fast as we can. So we are slow to learn.
When you were on this trip, there must have been some looking at some of what's happening in the rest of the world as well, and I'm thinking of the Middle East.
A little louder.
I'm just thinking about the Middle East and what's happening there now. I guess I struggle seeing what's happening in Gaza, knowing that some of what's happening in Gaza happened to the people of Israel.
Yeah, the trip was interesting in that regard because we got up in the morning and we started, and we had lectures on the bus going down the road. It was like, and so we did not talk about as a formal part of the class. We didn't talk about anything but the Holocaust, except for that one moment at crematoria number 5. That's really what I felt like he was saying, because he just, I don't know, somebody changes when they're speaking to you, they lower their voice, or they change the cadence of their voice, or they like really listen to me now, and he just said, you're remembering, you're learning, your remembrance is meaningless if it doesn't enable you to see where this is happening now. And I felt like, as far as the formal part of the week, and the structured part of the class, I felt that was the only time that Palestine was addressed without being addressed. Sometimes we'd eat supper like, I don't know, 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And that would just be group participants, and we'd kind of be off the clock, and everybody's pretty exhausted, and we really didn't have, you just didn't feel like having those kind of heavy conversations, at that time. But there were a couple of times during those off hours, particularly from folks, from other parts of the world. Those conversations about Gaza were not started by Europeans or North Americans, but the folks from the other part of the world. To them, the comparisons, and I think the lived reality of their experience, their proximity to their own genocides, events, yeah.
And part of my class studies, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the dates, but it was after World War II, and the world came together and gathered in the United Nations and said, never again, never again. Whole declaration talking about no more genocides. And yet every 10 years we've had some sort of genocide. What we're experiencing today, it's just continued. Somehow we don't get what that means, and we don't stand up for it. But the United Nations made that declaration. Whomever was involved in that declaration around the world, happened in Africa, it's happened in
Did that mean the whole human race? Never again this is going to happen to the whole human race?
That's what the document was saying.
But I was just gonna say though,
But,
it was a document that was for European people and Americans. It was not a document.
it was the United Nations, whoever was in it then.
Right. But I suspect they meant white people, white European people.
Oh,
I'm just
That's
gonna
interesting.
postulate and throw
That's
that out there.
interesting.
Well, and here in our country, we had the Jim Crow South, which was that was on a much smaller level, but it was acceptable to lynch a black person without trial, and you didn't get punished for it. I mean, I think about that a lot. Of just when we say, how can that happen? Well, it started here. I mean, it was happening for people in the South, and it could have,
Yes.
Or give them syphilis and not treat them.
right. And
So-
the way we,
Say it again.
Or give them syphilis and not treat them.
Right.
and we did that to Native Americans,
The blankets.
the blankets.
Well, if you read Isabel Wilkinson's Caste, she will point out in that the Nazis came, when the Nazis were trying to figure out how to run concentration camps and how to make people less than human, they looked at how we treated African Americans and how we treated people, North American indigenous people. We were their textbook. Maybe not their only one, but we were one of them.
And a president initiated some of that. And president initiated the Native American
Yeah.
blanket.
Oh, yeah.
And as a group that was learning and absorbing this horror of the Holocaust, did you have any discussions about what is our responsibility for younger generations in terms of educating them and how to do that? It seems a complicated task, obviously, but
Yeah, that's for me and Jeff, that is probably a conversation we need to have as a community in a much more extensive way, maybe even than we have. Most of the rest of the group either worked at something like, they were all public-facing people. There were a lot of, there was one young German woman who works at a museum at Berchtesgaden. One of Hitler's primary headquarters is a museum now. And, we're like 12 hours into the class, and she's like just about to wilt in a corner because every sentence, contains the phrase, the Germans did this, and 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 the Germans did this. And she's like, I'm German, so yeah, and there were other museum people there. They were just kind of all educators and peace workers and community organizers that are, that's what they do. How does a local congregation or a local community become an agency for the resistance of Holocaust, or remembrance and resistance of Holocaust, or what kind of conversations do we need to be having? And I think the first thing is, it could happen again. One of the ways I realized on this trip that I had heard that never, because we've heard never again all our lives, and one of the things that I realized was I had heard it as the adults in my world are drawing a line that will never be crossed. It was an emphatic never again, and turns out it was an aspiration, is what it was. It was a hope that we would live into. evidently, because we've not lived into it, and it has in fact happened again, and is happening now in places. Yeah, Penny.
Did your group discuss at all, after all of this education, how to deal with the Holocaust deniers these days? Because just being over here in our school, subbing, I mentioned the word Holocaust to the 6th graders, and they're like, what, huh? And I may have mentioned it too young, but it seems to me like that's getting to be an age where they should at least be familiar with what that was. And we have this lack of knowledge in our society about this, and lack of first-hand experiences from people, because they're dying, whoever was involved in it. And how do we combat this Holocaust denial thing, which is a big example of what we shouldn't be doing anymore?
Yeah, I don't know about the age appropriate, how you introduce the topic to, kids in an age appropriate way. But as far as for adults, it's against the law to deny the Holocaust in Germany. I think probably in our country, that would be a violation of the First Amendment. To deny somebody the freedom to deny the Holocaust would be a violation of the Constitution. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, you want to tell them just to go jump in the lake, but that's probably not going to engage them in a conversation that leads them to being in a better place. So, think of some nicer words, I guess. I'm sorry. But most all of these people live in countries that have such troubled histories that it's like, in Poland, it's against the law. In South Africa, it's against the law. In Germany, it's against the law to deny the Holocaust.
Did you find out what the penalties were for that being against the law? Like if somebody violates that law, do they get sent to prison or fined or what?
I don't know. It seemed to be an effective law, though, so it must have some weight behind it. Clive?
I understand that about a third of the victims of the Holocaust were killed by roving murder squads, or what they call Einsatzgruppen, that followed, that came in after the front lines. They weren't actually soldiers. Did you hear anything about that part of the Holocaust?
Yeah, the picture where I showed you the plaque that had John Paul's signature on it, that was a mass grave that was created by the killing of the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen was chapter 1 of the Holocaust. The Einsatzgruppen were killing Jews in massive numbers before there were any gas chambers, before the crematoria. They realized, one, they didn't have that many bullets. I just do the math on it. It's too many bullets, and it's tearing up our boys. They weren't raised to shoot innocent people. They're great warriors, but shooting unarmed women and children was not what they were trained to do. And so they're starting to get, the psychological health of the German soldier is being diminished by this Einsatzgruppen assignment. So it's not going to be the way that the Holocaust is ultimately finished, though it is the way that it starts. Bridget.
The town of Radagast you mentioned, what was it that was specific about that?
Well, that's a great question. Radagast is not a town. Radagast is the memorial at the train station in Wodes.
So it's a specific memorial.
Yeah, and the box cars were there, and there's some there are other components to that memorial, but I just gave you a picture of the box cars.
I wonder, those are striking memorials. Do you know who specifically, was there one artist or was there a group of an organization that put together some of these memorials?
Well, you know, they're timed. You know, they're going to be memorials immediately after the war. Those are going to be predominantly Soviet-era memorials, and they're going to be those big blocky things. And then after the wall comes down, there's more latitude and different groups. For everybody from families of survivors, foundations. It's amazing how many people all over the world, you know, have taken the time to do the work to remember, you know, everybody that they could. And of course, you know, there are more people not remembered, I'm sure, by name than those who are. But you know, you just see we did this for, you know, this particular person that we know died here in this place. And so after the wall comes down, I think, you know, there's just a lot more freedom to mark places and that sort of thing. Yeah, Ken?
If we go with the Holocaust would not have occurred without involvement of the church people, what was the goal as a church people to be involved? You usually do something because you're going to gain something. What was their reasoning for being involved in getting rid of the Jews?
You know, I can't really speak to that.
Purity of life? Hey, we got to be pure? What was it that they wanted to achieve?
Yeah. From a 1938 German perspective.
Yeah, from the Christian church, what were they trying to achieve?
But sometimes church people, not just in that particular period of history, but before then and since then, you know, church people compromise values and convictions and other things just to maintain proximity to power. You know, look, I went over to the Prime Minister's house last night. Yeah, we had supper. We do that about once a month. You know, we hang out together. He likes to hear what I think about things. You know, it's not always that blatant. Sometimes it's just kind of that subtle maintenance of the privilege that has always existed. You know, so present and so real that it's virtually invisible to the people who possess it. I don't know what it means to be a white male, because I never had to worry about it. You know, I just am. And with that means, you know, I don't have to worry about a ton of stuff that people of color worry about every day. I don't have to worry about a ton of stuff that women worry about every day in this country and in other countries. And there's certainly an element of religious privilege too, you know, and you just want to live into that. You know, I mean, it's not an authentic religion thing, but it's clad in religious garments. Yeah. We'll talk more about that in particular in about 4 weeks, when I'll do a session on the dangers of Christian nationalism in our country in 2024.
Do you think it ties back to the Jews were the ones that killed Jesus? I mean, because even before the Holocaust, their Jews were thought of as less than in some areas. Understanding.
Yeah, I think that was certainly something that the blood libel, and there's a whole range of Jewish hate, that justified. I mean, because the Holocaust is not the first time that Christians mistreated Jews. There's a whole history of pogroms, throughout Europe, throughout the medieval period, which is one of the reasons why, you have 3 million Jews living in Poland, because they had relationships with royalty in Poland that, had become mutually beneficial. I think in Germany, Christ killer was certainly heard, but there was also this kind of rhetoric that like the Jews are going to kill us. They're going to contaminate us. They're going to kill us. They're going to take our jobs. They're going to replace us. They're going to undermine us. They're going to weaken our nation. If we don't, it's not that we need to so much that we need to get rid of them. It's if we don't stop them, we won't be here anymore because they're going to kill us.
I was just thinking, a book that I read was saying that there was pretty significant anti-Semitism already, in Germany, and that it was about the rise of fascism, the kind of the levels of how things come together to get to that place. And so in various pockets in Germany, there was some pretty extensive and blatant anti-Semitism. And then I was thinking after the war, World War I, one of the issues in Germany was, they were just they were having huge economic problems. And blaming it on the Jews was the other thing too.
Right.
Yeah. If we really want to move forward, we're going to take care of these people. Because they're going to.
Shelley?
And part of that, Patty, is the Jewish people were a more educated people.
Yeah.
They could read, they could write, they could have academic discourse, and so that put them in a different position with royalty or with the hierarchy, because they could, and the others did not understand that. And then there was the mystery about the Jewish faith.
Mm-hmm. And it may be as simple as, they were different. You don't have to make it more complicated than it is. There may be more to it than that, but we need somebody to blame. Here's a minority. They're different than us. Let's make them really different.
And they had more. Somehow they had.
Yeah.
And where is all that happening? It's happening at home. It's happening in the classroom. It's happening in the workplace. It's obvious and sometimes just subtle anti-Semitism. But I believe that James Clavell wrote a very small book compared to his big books like Noble House and Children. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about the results of a world war in which the totalitarian states were victorious, took over the schools, and how in a matter of hours, let alone days or weeks, to influence the minds of children. They know nothing else.
Yeah.
Okay? And even though it wasn't as obvious, as Nazi Germany, everybody is saying it. It was going on and continues to go on to this day in our schools and in our homes, in our workplace. And it's easy to attack. And Clavell showed so beautifully and so simply how quickly children's minds can be completely controlled. And that's what was happening in Nazi Germany. Another thing I really want to relate was an experience I had, I don't know, it must be 50 years ago now, I'm 78 years old. I think I was in Greece in school, and there were some German students, and I sat with a German student who described to me how his educational experience as a inheritor of Nazi Germany, and how the young Germans were illegal to I think he was clearly brainwashed in a direction which was certainly more welcome to me, okay, as someone who recognized that Germany did an evil thing, and the children of Germany were now being educated that should never happen again. And in Germany, apparently, it won't, because it's illegal, and that's what it takes.
Yeah.
It's not about a moralistic rectitude. It's, I don't want to go to jail if I say what I really think. Okay, and they might really still be really thinking that in Germany, but it's not legal to think that way. And there needs to be more of that. It's about education. It's about reaching the children. But you said, how do you know at what point in a child's life that is most appropriate and effective?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah, public education is not what it was.
No.
Wish we had still had teachers like Erica. Nancy, and then Dave.
Well, this is ironically changing the subject a bit, but I met a young woman today who is Israeli from Tel Aviv, and she said her parents didn't want her to come home. They wanted her to go somewhere else in the world where she can be safe. And that is changing a bit, but we all know what's happening in Gaza and Israel, and how can that be happening?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just constantly, she can't go back to her family because they're so afraid. Now, is this anti-Semitism? That's carried too far. I know that's not true. It was not part of your training. It's just coming. This woman can't. This young woman, she's a teenager, can't go back to Togo.
Yeah.
Doesn't Israel have, young people have to, don't they have to do 2 years of military service? And she does, yeah, so.
Dave?
Just kind of an overview of Jewish people in Europe. There were Jewish people in the Roman Empire. There were Jewish people on the Rhine, and towns in the Rhine, and Rome, and ignoring the Jerusalem in 71. But a lot of the Jews that came into Central Europe came when they were expelled from Spain, when the Christians finally drove out the Moors. There was a rich mixture of people in Spain, in Moorish areas, of Jewish and Christian and Muslim people. In fact, some of the Greek texts and things like that were translated there in medieval times, had an enormous influence on Europe, because more Greek things were saved by the Muslims than by Christians. But my point is, Jewish people moved, the Anastasians and other groups, into Europe more from, driven out of Spain in, I guess, after the time of 1492, with the fall of and so, they were ghettoized, so there were many laws against Jews participating. They couldn't be in the government, they couldn't be in certain businesses and things like that. But because they didn't have the stigma of usury, they were important to kings and royalty in Europe. So they had some value. But after the French Revolution and Napoleon and all, there was a real attempt to abolish all the laws against Jews in Europe, and the general enlightenment and liberalism and the growth of democracies in Europe. So that was a very important step, and so Jewish people did have more freedom economically and everything, and more involvement. And you make a long list of incredible Jewish people. But there was a shift in the 19th century from saying, oh, Jewish people, it's a cultural matter or it's a religious matter, to identifying Jewish people as a separate race. That was the origins of anti-Semitism. And the idea was, with the liberalization of laws against Jews, that they would integrate into European society. But as the 19th century went on, some people said, no, they're too different, they're too opposite than us in all the European countries. And it's a race, it's not a group of people, So that's what kind of led ultimately to the stigmatization and the blameism and the scapegoating with the collapse of Germany and then the depression and then the rise of the Nazis, because it was they felt no, they're too different. But it's a tragedy because they were integrating into all European countries. And, so we have to be careful of people who use fear and hatred to make puppets of people. You really have to counter that and take it very seriously. And especially people who use the mask of religion when they're doing that. You can't let them get away with it because we know where it ends. It ends with tremendous human suffering. The idea of deporting 10 million people, this is evil. Let's be clear about that. Equality because
Very true, very true.
That's one of the things that I've noticed is like the vocabulary of Holocaust words, deportation being one of them. It's a Holocaust word. It's a Shoah word. You hear it a lot in U.S. political discourse these days. It's not a good place, but that's where we're going to end. Thank you. Thank you. And Kyle, we're not worthy. We're not worthy.